So let's talk about the warm-up. Again, I found another cute picture of a cat relating to cardiovascular system. So I got that going. All right. So we started with a blood cell. What is that blood cell there? It's a classic. What is that blood cell in the middle of the picture?
Neutrophil.
That is a neutrophil. And how do we know it's a neutrophil?
Because of the nucleus.
Yeah, it's got that crazy weird nucleus. And usually it's multi-lobed and it's got little granules. It's one of the granulocytes, but the granules are very fine. You don't really see them very well. And it's also, you know, bigger. What are these other little cells all around it? What are the rest of the, those are all the red. So the red blood cells are the main cells, but this is one of the white blood cells, a neutrophil. And what does it do? What's its job?
Destroys bacteria.
So it does. So it's part of your immune system. How about more specifically, what does it do?
Phagocytosis.
The front deep.
So it's a phagocyte. So phagocytosis of bacteria. You know, when I haven't graded them all. I gave people credit for this first round, just saying that it's part of your body defenses or, you know, killing bacteria. But ultimately, you should know a little deeper that it's actually about phagocytosis, about eating things. So that is that, as opposed to like the lymphocytes, which do very different kinds of things. And we'll talk about lymphocytes a little more in detail when we talk about the lymphatic system today. So what is the most numerous of all the cell types found in the blood? Found in the blood.
Red blood cells.
Yeah, red blood cells. And what is another word for red blood cells?
Erythrocytes.
Yeah, you could also say erythrocytes. And what's the primary function of those dudes?
Make hemoglobin.
Say that again.
They make hemoglobin.
So that's they do make hemoglobin. They're full of hemoglobin, but to what end? When I think about function, it's like, what are they? What's their role? What are they? Why do they have hemoglobin?
They transport oxygen and carbon dioxide.
Exactly. So they transport oxygen. And I didn't even mention that, but they actually do transport some carbon dioxide as well.
I put erythrocytes and I put that it carries oxygen to the body, and it says I got it wrong.
Right. It's probably because of the spelling or something. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. What I said, you know, I said that there's all these different settings. I don't want the actual answers to be available until everybody's turned it in, but at this point the answers are available, so you can actually see what the actual answers are up there. But usually, you know, if you wrote, you know, erythrocyte and I had erythrocytes in the answer, you'd get it wrong. So I go back manually and I double check everything. Oh my God, it's a blood drop. This time it's Bartholomew, and he's in the right hand, and he's unloaded his delivery of oxygen, and he wants to get to the lungs. So what are the steps that little Bartholomew can take to get to the lungs? So he's in the hand right now.
You can take that ulnar vein up.
Yeah, so there's an ulnar vein. What's another way he could have done it?
Cephalic vein.
Yeah, there's the cephalic vein would go up. What's another vein he could start with?
Radial vein.
Radial vein he could start. What's another one he could start with?
Basilic.
Basilic. Those are all possible. right? I mean, part of the thing about the veins, like I said, there's a lot of anastomoses, lots of different paths you can take to get to the same place. And depending which one he started on, if he started with the ulnar or the radial, he'd have to go to the brachial. If he started from the cephalic or bacillic, he's probably going to end up just back at the subclavian. From the subclavian, where are you going to go?
Through the superior vena cava.
So before that, though, subclavian goes to the
Brachiocephalic vein.
the brachiocephalic vein. That's the one that branches both to the arm and to the head. So the jugular and the subclavian meet there. And then that is the one that ultimately is going to go into the superior vena cava. And once he's...
I have a question. Before the subclavian, does it go to the brachial vein?
The brachial vein, if you were going from the ulnar or radial, you could have done brachial vein to the subclavian.
Okay, thank you.
How about from the vena cava? What's next?
Right atrium.
That's going to be the right atrium. And from there, where we're going?
The tricuspid.
It was, which one?
The tricuspid.
Yeah, you're going to go past the tricuspid AV valve.
Into the right ventricle.
The right ventricle. Then where does he go next?
The pulmonary semilunar valve out into the
Pulmonary.
pulmonary trunk.
And finally, pulmonary trunk branches into the
Pulmonary artery.
pulmonary arteries. And those are going to finally take him to the, and he has completed his journey. Like I said, on your exam next week, you'll meet another one of these little blood drops that has got a big journey, but it's probably going to be, again, so far you've had like these kind of smaller journeys, but we'll probably have some that start somewhere, has to like go someplace, come back, come place somebody else. So make sure when you're thinking about the names of things, think about how they connect, think about what's coming to the heart, what's leaving the heart, think about how you get through the heart, think about how you're in systemic versus pulmonary and back to systemic. So all of that.
I had a question really quick. If we use bacillic vein, can we just jump straight to the subclavian vein, or do we have to say like, oh, it
No,
like passes
subclavian.
the...
No, it would be fine just to go straight to the subclavian.
Okay.
All right, question 4. So which kind of structure is indicated by this photomicrograph?
The vein.
Vein.
So that is going to be a vein, not a nerve, a vein. And we know it's a vein. How do we know it's a vein?
Tunica media.
Say it again. I missed.
Tunica media.
So it's got a very thin tunica media. If you look at this one, it's got this super fat tunica media. So a classic artery is going to have very thick walls with a lot of smooth muscle. Veins have a very thin layer of smooth muscle, and just some connective tissue on the outside here. You can also see this does tend to have a little more misshapen. It doesn't hold its lumen as well. What about these things? What are the things down to this below the vein here?
Nerves.
Yeah, those are nerves. And again, next we have, or not next, finally, Our ultimate question, name the vein inside your elbow that you typically draw blood from.
Median cubital vein.
Median cubital vein. So that should get me, let's see. Right, so Elsa, this kind of shows you how this works, right? I typed in erythrocytes, which is perfectly a correct answer, but when I was like making up the answer key, I wrote erythrocyte or red blood cell. I didn't write erythrocytes. So it means I just have to manually say, oh, no, that's actually okay. When I'm grading it, I just fix it. So you can't trust whatever number it gives you. And if you ever, when you look at the answers and it says like, oh, you got it wrong, you wrote erythrocytes when the answer was erythrocyte, you can be assured that, I'll fix that. Okie dokie. Sure. Let's see. There's just a couple of things I wanted to finish up about the cardiovascular system before we move on. I realized there's a couple of clinical aspects that I didn't mention that are worth mentioning. So let's do that. And then we're gonna be done with the cardiovascular system, and we'll be done with everything that you're responsible for the upcoming test. So let me stop this share. So last thoughts on the cardiovascular system. All right, so one thing we've been talking about, blood vessels. There are a couple of things that commonly go wrong with blood vessels, particularly like with arteries that have a lot of pressure. If you have a weakening of the wall, it can start ballooning out. So if the wall starts ballooning out because of a weakening in the wall, what do we call that?
An aneurysm.
What is an aneurysm? So this obviously, minimally, it can be a problem just because it's going to put pressure on surrounding structures because it's just kind of ballooning out there. And it can get really bad if it bursts. A burst aneurysm, then all of a sudden you're going to have blood spewing out there. Depending which artery it is, it can be catastrophic. If it's like your aorta or one of the major cerebral arteries, you're going to just die pretty quick. If it's a smaller one, you'll still have kind of really bad internal hemorrhaging because these are under a lot of pressure. One of the ways you can get strokes, when we talked about a stroke is when you have a problem with blood flow to part of your brain. You can get strokes when you get little clots that block the blood flow, but you can also get hemorrhagic strokes where a blood vessel breaks and then you just get bleeding and therefore the blood isn't going to perfuse the tissue it should. So aneurysm, in general, it's not a good thing. If they find you have an aneurysm and it hasn't burst, there are a number of medical procedures they can do to go in and try to reinforce it. There's little things that little sleeves they can put over it or other different things to try to make sure that it's going to get reinforced and not have a catastrophic failure. So aneurysm is something you should know. Another classic problem with blood vessels. Again, typically you have your, the walls of your blood vessel and the blood's flowing through. Atherosclerosis. Actually, I think I just misspelled it. So this is hardening of the arteries. This is when you get both fat and proliferation of smooth muscle within the tunica media. So the wall ends up getting like kind of pushed in. So here's like the tunica intima here. So this thing here, this is called a plaque, an atherosclerotic plaque. So it's like lipid and smooth muscle. So it's not in the lumen, it's in the wall. So the plaque is in the tunica media. People often get this idea that you're eating like high fat foods and the fat is literally clogging your arteries, which is not true. No. The fat does not actually get in, clog your arteries directly like that. But what it does do, high fat diets initiates a more complex inflammation response that results in the formation of these plaques within the walls of the blood vessels. And when you have that forming, it then starts narrowing the diameter and it makes it harder for the blood to go through. And that constriction is obviously going to be a problem in terms of making sure you have adequate blood flow downstream. It means the blood pressure has to be higher to try to keep the blood moving. So in general, bad thing. And when people get coronary bypass operations, typically what's going on, you've got the heart with the aorta coming off. And then we talked about you have the coronary arteries coming off to supply the heart. If you have those atherosclerotic plaques in these coronary arteries, that means you're not going to get adequate blood flow to your heart. So that's when they go and they snip out your great saphenous vein and they can go and just make a bypass over the part that was narrowed, so then you can still have adequate blood flow going to your cardiac muscle. So when people cardiac bypass operation, it just means putting a little snippet of good vessel to bypass the area where you've got these plaques and therefore the blood is having trouble flowing.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Can they just remove the plaque instead of like doing that whole thing, or is that impossible?
So there are ways, so there are these things where they go and they put this little catheter up. I think they usually go up through your femoral vein. They call it balloon angioplasty. They literally take this thing, it goes up. Oops, I need to get my pen. It goes up into your vessel. It has a little thing on it, and then they can actually pump air into it, and then that little thing balloons out and kind of breaks it up and widens it again. It will help, at least for the short term, but I think there's evidence if you do this, it causes damage, and it's not necessarily going to be an awesome long-term solution. I think they're super common. I think they're like really, really common. I think it's a cash cow for a lot of kind of medical practices is to do these. There are other ways. There's other ones where they run catheters up, I think with even little blades that run through and kind of try to clear stuff out. I'm not sure. I don't know all the details of that. But definitely I know that these are very common procedures to go in and try to just kind of push and break things up and widen things up again. So that is that. The other clinical situation that is related to the cardiovascular system that I will mention is anemia. So anemia is a kind of general thing, is when you don't have adequate oxygen getting delivered to your tissues. And there's a bunch of different ways you can get this. You know, what kind of things could go wrong that are gonna result in you not delivering adequate oxygen to your tissues? What cells are important for delivering the oxygen?
Red blood cells.
The red blood cells. So anything that affects the either number or efficacy of your red blood cells can cause anemia. You can have hemorrhagic anemia. You've just bled out a bunch and you don't have a lot of enough adequate red blood cells. And it means that you aren't gonna be able to deliver adequate oxygen to your tissues. When I was in undergrad, I had a major cut and bled out really bad. And in the end, it took, you know, for a few days, I even walked up a step and I was dizzy and wanted to pass out. So if you don't have enough red blood cells around, you aren't going to deliver oxygen. If you can't make the hemoglobin for the red blood cells, you'll have anemia. So you can have like iron deficiency anemia. Remember, because iron is important for the heme group, for the little part of the hemoglobin molecule that binds the oxygen. So if you don't have adequate iron, you won't have adequate hemoglobin and you'll have trouble carrying enough oxygen around. You can have vitamin deficiencies that affect your ability to just make the red blood cells. There's something called pernicious anemia. This is lacking vitamin B12. So vitamin B12, we'll talk about that a little later when we get to the digestive system. It's absorbed in the stomach and it's necessary for a number of things, including making your red blood cells. So if you're not making them, you're in trouble. You can have genetic diseases where the genetic code to make the hemoglobin is off. That's when you get sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia, there's literally one base pair that's off in the whole gene to make the hemoglobin. But what it means is when the blood ends up having lower oxygen, the blood cells kind of fold up. The hemoglobin grabs onto itself in this weird way. So normally blood cells always look kind of frisbees, you know, with a dimple, kind of dimpled frisbees. But in sickle cell anemia, they actually kind of fold in on themselves, kind of like a hot dog bun or something. And then when they do that, they have trouble getting through the blood vessels and kind of clog up and all that. So that can be a problem. Another kind of anemia, where are the blood cells getting made?
In the marrow.
In the bone marrow. So you can have something called aplastic anemia. This is when you have, for instance, if you're undergoing radiation therapy for cancer, this is when you have, you're killing off the bone marrow cells, the hemocytoblasts that are making the blood cells in the first place. So you can get anemia from that. So there's lots of different things that can go wrong. So that's anemia. A couple of other things, when people talk about cancer, again, cancer, what is cancer? What's going on in cancer?
Uncontrolled.
Yeah, uncontrolled cell division. What if it's your leukocytes that are dividing uncontrollably? What do we call that?
Leukemia.
That's leukemia. So like when you think about people talk about leukemia all the time. It just means it's a cancer of your blood cells. And again, we actually in the lab, we have some slides that are taken from a patient with leukemia, and you can just see there are so many white blood cells in the blood. Normally, it's mainly red blood cells, and every once in a while you see a white blood cell. In the leukemia patient, it's just full of white blood cells, and most of them are they're weird looking. They don't look like normal. You can tell they're white blood cells, but they're off. And there's lots of versions of leukemia. We don't have to go into that. So this is going to be end of material for lecture and lab exams 2. So now we are going to introduce the lymphatic system. And I will start with kind of the classic thing, lymphatic system. What are the functions? What does it do? This one is not as well known as the other systems, and it's actually a little more diverse in terms of its jobs. So what is the lymphatic system doing? Anybody? Anybody read ahead?
Draining lymph. I have
So
minimal
draining lymph. What is lymph? What the heck is lymph?
Isn't it just, I don't, I'm sure it's more complicated, but fluid of some kind, so draining it and inflammation.
Right. So we're gonna go back to the cardiovascular system, to a continuous capillary bed right now. So here I've got my arterioles coming in and coming into my capillary bed here. The other end of the capillary bed, oh, it turned blue. My venule on the other side. So the blood comes in, the blood comes out. Outside, these are just all my cells of the tissue. The space between cells is called the interstitial space. Right, so you have your cells, and then there's space in between the cells. And that is filled with fluid in general. It's called the extracellular fluid, the interstitial fluid. And as the blood is coming into the capillary bed, capillaries are optimized to exchange things with the surrounding tissue, deliver nutrients and hormones and oxygen and pick stuff up. So even continuous capillaries, regular capillaries, are pretty leaky. And it turns out, and they're under pressure. The blood is coming in. It's not as high as the blood leaving the heart, but the blood pressure is still like around 40 millimeters of mercury as it enters into the capillary bed. And water is leaking out of the capillaries into the tissue, into the interstitial space. So H2O leaks out. The cells stay in, the large proteins stay in, but water and small dissolved things can leak out. There are different processes. Most of the fluid that leaks out gets kind of sucked back in due to osmotic pressure by the end of the capillary bed, but you still have a net loss of about 3 liters per day. So you have about 3 liters. That's a lot. That's like, 2/3 of your blood volume leaves your capillaries just into this interstitial space, into the space between the cells every day. Obviously, for 2 big reasons, you got to collect that and dump it back into your closed circulatory system. One is, if you don't do that, your blood is going to turn to sludge because all the water's gone and all you're left is with the cells and stuff. Also, the tissue is going to start just getting more and more kind of swollen as the interstitial space gets filled up with more and more fluid. In fact, we're going to talk about a condition where the lymphatic system isn't working properly is lymphedema, where you start getting a bunch of fluid building up within the interstitial space. So the lymph one job is going to be to collect this leaked fluid and return it back into the closed circulatory system. So let me go back here. So one job, oops, maybe it's quicker to type it. So it's going to collect that fluid and it's going to dump it back into your bloodstream. It's basically got a little duct where it's going to dump it back basically into the subclavian vein. In that process, it's also going to filter that fluid. Will filter and clean along the way. So that is part of what the lymphatic system is doing. It's collecting this fluid that leaks out, returning it to the closed circulatory system, and we're going to see there's a system of lymph nodes that basically kind of cleans and filters this fluid before it actually returns. And then the other big thing is it has a big role in body defenses. This class, we don't go into a lot of detail about the immune system. I'm going to talk about it a little bit, in our discussion of the lymphatic system. But the basic idea is your body is moist and warm and full of nutritious molecules. And it's the perfect place. If you were some little bacteria, try to find a place to set up camp and start raising your family of dividing bacterial cells, you want someplace warm and moist and full of nutrition. So there's all sorts of things that would start dividing, and you need to constantly go in and try to protect yourself from those. So you've got all sorts of cells and other processes going around that are trying to keep bad, the bad actors from making you sick. Not all bacteria are bad. You've got a lot of bacteria that live in your body that are perfectly, in balance with you. Like in your intestine, we're going to talk about like half of the volume of your feces are actually bacteria that live inside your colon. There's all sorts of bacteria on, we'll talk about different versions of this, but some bacteria are actually your friends. So not all bacteria are bad, but some of them are. Viruses as well. I mean, duh, right now, viruses you want to deal with.
Is that why your lymph nodes kind of like swell up when you're sick? Sometimes like around like your jaw, you can like feel
Yeah.
them
So
swollen.
we're going to talk explicitly about that. So that's exactly what's happening. Like if you are sick, your lymphocytes start multiplying and start upping the production of antibodies, and that is going to make the lymph nodes get more swollen as the lymphocytes start multiplying. And we'll see underneath your cervical region, your axillary region are places where you have large collections of lymph nodes. So when people talk about swollen glands, it's because the immune cells, the lymphocytes are multiplying, the lymph nodes are enlarging, and you can actually feel that. Your own cells can go bad, right? Cancer, right? We talk about cancer. Cancer is your own cell that starts dividing out of control. So part of your body defenses are actually not about, protecting you from outside forces. Part of your body defenses are actually about, protecting you from your own cells that are going rogue. So that's another thing that your body defenses do, are kind of check on the health of cells, and any cell that is malfunctioning is going to get taken out. So that's another thing that immune system does. So again, we'll talk a little bit about this. Let me, in fact, while I can introduce the idea of lymphocytes just very briefly here. So lymphocytes, we talked about as, the blood cell, white blood cell. This is involved in what we call specific immunity, sometimes called adaptive immunity. These are ones that can recognize and identify very specific pathogens. Other kinds of cells are just about recognizing something that doesn't look right, right? Like there are bacteria will have things on their wall that just would never be on one of your own cells, so it doesn't belong. But the lymphocytes get primed and activated to recognize a very specific kind of shape. Hopefully at some point, if there's a vaccine for this novel coronavirus, for the COVID-19 disease, what's going to happen is that vaccine is going to stimulate your body to create populations of lymphocytes that specifically recognize the novel coronavirus. And then, so if that ever gets into your body will say, oh, I recognize it. I have an army of lymphocytes that are specifically cloned to recognize and attack and neutralize that particular virus, and then you aren't going to get sick from it. So
Wait.
lymphocyte,
Can they just like get those antibodies from someone that already like healed from it?
so you can get antibodies from someone that, so that's called passive immunity, but it's temporary. So once those antibodies are gone, then you're not protected anymore. When you have your own body create a reaction like what happens in a vaccine, then you have what are called memory cells. And so then you're going to have this more long-term protection. Like, for instance, when I was in grad school, we went down on this dive trip down to Mexico, and I caught hepatitis A and got really, really, really sick. And my roommates all got shots, it's called gamma globulin, that instantly protected them from Hep A, so they weren't going to get sick from being in the same house with me. However, like a year later, they were not protected anymore, because once the antibodies that they got injected with wore out, they were back to where they started. Whereas my system, having actually had to fight the virus and then create its own clone armies of these lymphocytes, it means I can never get that disease again. So it is possible to get temporary protection, but if you want long-term protection, you need to make sure your lymphocytes are actually stimulated to create their own reaction in your body.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Lymphocytes, a couple of more things about lymphocytes. You know, ultimately they're made where all blood cells are made, in the bone marrow, but there are two populations, and they mature in different places. So there's going to be B lymphocytes. These mature in the bone marrow. That's why they're called B lymphocytes. They mature in the bone marrow. T lymphocytes. These mature in the thymus gland. The thymus gland is, like, if here's your heart, here's your trachea. So there's like an adult, and here's a baby. In a baby, the thymus gland is really big. It's all kind of over the heart like that. And as you get older, it gets smaller and smaller. Like in our old cadavers, you don't really even see it at all. So it's most apparent in young. It makes different, who was that? That was funny. It makes different kinds of hormones that help the lymphocytes mature. It plays a role in actually weeding out. Like, you don't want to have any lymphocytes that recognize your own tissues, because if that happens, then you're going to end up with an autoimmune disease. You only want your immune system to fight, things that you don't want in your body. If you have an autoimmune disease like lupus, you just attack your own tissues and you are starting to fight yourself. Or in multiple sclerosis, you start attacking your own myelin sheaths and demyelinating your own central nervous system neurons. Or rheumatoid arthritis, you start attacking your own synovial membranes and creating horrible inflammation in all your joints. So it's really important to try to remove any lymphocyte that has any possibility of starting to attack your own body. So we're not going to talk much more about the thymus gland. If we were doing fetal pigs, when you open up your fetal pig, it's really obvious. It's there, this big goopy thing, kind of over the heart. When we look in the cadavers, you really don't see it. So just kind of putting that out there. If you go to fancy French restaurants and you order sweetbreads, usually what you're eating is a thymus gland. Just in case you're wondering, like, what was that weird kind of really fatty, goopy, but yummy thing I ate at that fancy French restaurant? It was a thymus gland from some cow or something. So, all right, back to where we were. I'm looking at the time. All right, so we're back here. We have our blood coming into the capillaries, coming out of the capillaries, but in the process, H2O is leaking out. And so let's look at how we deal with that. So for whatever reason, lymphatic vessels are not green. If anything, they're kind of like a golden color. But there has been a convention in anatomy since long before I ever started doing anatomy that, blood vessels with oxygenated blood are red, blood vessels with deoxygenated blood are blue, and lymphatic vessels are green. So I am going, who am I to buck convention here? So I'm going to draw in these little lymph capillaries. So they are all over through your tissue. They are made out of simple squamous epithelium like a normal capillary, however, with a few differences. One big difference is those endothelial cells have the ability to kind of flap open. What that means is that they can absorb much larger things than a normal capillary. And basically, these are kind of anchored in the connective tissue. And as you move around, these things kind of get pulled and sucked and squished. So you get this kind of little suction thing where just whatever the fluid and any little small dissolved things are just constantly getting sucked into these lymph capillaries. So basically, they are sitting here in the tissue. They are kind of vacuuming up leaked fluid and small stuff. And again, it doesn't even have to be, they can actually flap open and bring in something as big as a cell. So they can open up pretty big. In fact, the way your lymphocytes move around in your system are they hop into lymph vessels and can move from like one place to another. So you have lymph capillaries. These then they're all over. I'm trying to just draw them all over. Becoming larger and larger lymph vessels. those end up all going, filtering through these little, they're about the size of a little bean. They go into these things called lymph nodes, which are going to be a place where you kind of filter the lymph as it's moving along. We'll talk more about a lymph node in a moment. It's basically going to be full of white blood cells, lymphocytes and macrophages and stuff. And then ultimately, where is this going to go? So all of this fluid that's getting collected and filtered, where do we ultimately want to send it?
Back into the closed circulatory system.
Exactly. So, you know, here's the heart. You know, here's the brachiocephalic veins going into the vena cava. And it's basically gonna just dump it back right there. So this is kind of the basic idea of this: collect the fluid from your tissues. Obviously, it's not just one lymph node. There's tons of lymph nodes. I'll show this to you in more detail in a little bit. It's filtered and keeps moving back and ends up in the veins. It's kind of right at the junction of the brachiocephalic and the subclavian vein there. So that is that. Let's talk a little more about how lymph vessels are different from regular, lymph capillaries are different from regular capillaries. You know, obviously they're blind alleys, right? Normally a capillary starts someplace and goes someplace. These just kind of start in the middle of nowhere. So what keeps the lymph actually moving, right? There's no heart here, right? There's no heart. You know, blood keeps flowing because we have a heart generating blood pressure. What is going to generate the pressure that keeps this thing moving?
Would it be the surrounding muscles?
Yes, it's going to be a lot like the movement in the veins. So you're going to have one-way valves again. Let me go back to that other. So all these are going to have one-way valves. There's going to be massaging by the skeletal muscle. Right? Which is going to help squish things along just like we saw with the veins. Another thing, these often actually get kind of bundled along like with arteries. So if you have an artery nearby, as the artery is kind of pulsing, that can actually help massage these and keep the lymph moving as well. So just kind of the pulsing and moving and squishing of the external structures helps keep the lymph moving along, you know, from your tissues back to your heart.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
So by skeletal muscle, you're talking about just like normal muscles, like in your body,
Yeah.
like your muscles. It just does that.
Yeah. So skeletal muscle is just, you know, all the regular voluntary muscles that, you know, everywhere.
Oh, okay.
So like your biceps and your triceps and let's see. So lymph vessels. Let me talk a little more about the lymph vessels. They are set up in this big network that have names, but you only are responsible for 2 named lymph vessels in our class. So that's nice. So let me talk about the 2 lymphatic vessels that you need to know by name. So I'm going to draw my person. That's a stinky person, but it's good enough. God. All right, so there's the heart. Brachiocephalic and vena cava. So here's the person. There's an asymmetry here. I have no idea why it ended up like this, but it is what it is. The upper right-hand part of the body kind of the right half of your head and your right arm, they all drain together into this one duct called the right lymphatic duct that enters into the right brachiocephalic. All the rest of your body, the whole lower part of your body, drains into this other one, which is called the thoracic duct. So this right lymphatic duct is just the upper right of your body.
And you said all of that drains into the brachiocephalic vein?
Exactly. And there's this area, this kind of, if I look at the thoracic duct, this area that's kind of widened near the, it's kind of in the abdominal region. It has a special name called the cisterna chyli. It gets its name. This is where all the lymph is returning from the digestive organs. And we're going to see it's actually going to be important for the absorption of your fats. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Yeah, I can show you actually. Let me. Yeah, this will work. So I've got like my little dude here. So first thing I can do is just, I'll turn on the lymphatics. So you can see, you know, they're all over the place. And we're going to talk more about the specific lymph nodes and stuff, but you can just see there's all these little vessels, and as they go in, they go through these little nodes where they're getting filtered. This thing here, this is actually supposed to be the cisterna chyli, this kind of bottom of the thoracic duct here that's kind of heading up to, here we can see the thoracic duct. Let me turn off the bones. And actually, here's the thymus gland. I'm going to just get rid of the thymus gland for now. We're going to talk about the spleen a little later. I'm going to hide the spleen for now. Oh, it's going to make sense to turn on the veins here. So now, if we, wow. Let me not get spazzy on you. Here we go. So here's this cisterna chyli, this bottom of the thoracic duct, kind of going up and continuing up. And it's like, oh my God, there it is. Like, you know, going into the, basically into the subclavian or brachiocephalic. It's kind of right at the junction there. It doesn't, you know, it's 6 one, half dozen of the other. So that is the thoracic duct. It's draining the lower body as well as the upper left. It has this kind of thickened part near the bottom, the cisterna chyli, that is draining the digestive organs, and we'll talk about why that's important in a few moments. Then if we look over here on the other side, this is the right lymphatic duct, which is draining the right side of the body here. So whack. So here's the right side of the body, which drains into this little right lymphatic duct. Again, which just enters into the veins. And again, once it enters the veins, it goes down the vena cava, and now all that leak fluid is back in your system. So let's stop that. Where? So those are the main ducts. Those are the only two ducts you need to know: the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct. And it's actually, I'm noticing it's 2 o'clock. So what we're going to do when we get back, we need to talk then about the immune parts of the lymphatic system. And we can look at both how those show up in the lymph nodes, as well as in other things like the spleen, as well as we'll see actually just lining all along inside different tubes in your body. So let's take a break and we'll return at, how about 2:40 p.m. Oh, welcome back. So one of the things it's worth doing is looking at some of the conditions that occur if the lymphatics are not draining your interstitial fluid. So one of the conditions, this is luckily not something we got to deal with here, but it happens in Africa and places. There's this little worm called Filarius that ends up being this parasite that gets in and starts scarring up all your lymph vessels. And if the lymph vessels aren't working, then you just have fluid building up in the tissue. And I can share some absolutely horrific images.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
So the lymph nodes, they also take out like waste from the cells, right? Or it's just fluid they take out?
They take out, they filter the fluid as it's going along.
Okay, so they're taking out waste.
There's like white blood cells in there that can eat things that shouldn't be there, for instance.
Okay. Hey.
So we are going to share some horrific images here. So these, let me bring this up so I can see what you're seeing. So basically there's this little worm that starts blocking up your lymph vessels. And I mean, here you can like view image. Like, look, this is somebody's leg in their foot. If that fluid just keeps accumulating and accumulating and accumulating and never drains properly. So you get this horrible, it's called edema, when the fluid just builds up in the tissue. Here's, somebody's leg. Again, you can see it's just, it was always kind of interesting in at least the old version of Marib. She would say, the lymphatic system it's not a superstar, but it still does cool things, and and it doesn't get the same props like the cardiovascular system or the respiratory system. But when you see pictures like this, it's like, oh my God, I am so glad I have a lymphatic system. So this is, again, this disease when oh my God, this is his scrotum. This is his scrotal sac is just swollen with fluid. There are pictures of people who have to carry their scrotums around in wheelbarrows in Africa who have this. So again, it's horrifying.
And this happens, when the lymphatic system isn't working properly, or what exactly is missing?
Yeah, it's those the little worms have scarred up the lymph vessels, so they're no longer draining the interstitial fluid.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Right, because typically you have that I mean, I don't know if it's here. If I go into here, this is, this is the system of all the little lymph vessels going all over in your body. And you've constantly got fluid leaking out of the capillaries into the tissue spaces. And you constantly have all these little vessels draining that, filtering it and dumping it back into your closed circulatory system. So if you've got little worms that are clogging up these vessels, then the fluid just builds up and you get that horrible edema.
Can you drain that fluid?
Not really, because how do you drain it? It's kind of like draining like a sponge or something. It's just kind of in between all the cells. So I'm not sure how they do that. I mean, I know actually when people have edema, they tend to give them more diuretics, just try to get more water out of their body and stuff. So there's lymphedema, which can occur from lots of different things. Like if you have congestive heart failure, where you have like more like if the systemic circulation is pushing out more blood out to your systemic side than the other side of the heart can take up, you start getting pressure, fluid leaking out of the systemic circulation, and you get this horrible edema. Again, you can see here's another example. Just look what happens when you just have fluid leaking into the interstitial space and not draining. One of the ways this is actually, it's worth knowing, like, how do we know this person doesn't just have a really fat arm? How do we know this is an adipose? And there's a really easy way to tell. And it's what we call, so like pitting edema. I'm gonna type this in here. Pitting lymphedema. So the basic idea with edema is if it was fat and you pushed in on it and it would just kind of bounce right back. But when you have edema, it's kind of more like smart foam. When you push in on it, it will just stay. Let me see if this is a better image. These are still done. I'm gonna, hold on, I need to get. Oh, a bigger picture. Maybe this was 200. You're kind of getting the idea. Pitting edema, if you push and the impression just stays there, then you know that it's not just fat. If it was fat, it would just bounce back. But if it's edema, you basically kind of displace the water. And when you take your finger away, the pit just stays there and slowly kind of refills. So edema is very different. I had somebody once who had this, let me just push on them, and it's just kind of weird. It's like, you push in and then you take your finger away and you could just see your fingerprints on them. And then slowly it kind of disappears. So anyway, if you're wondering like how important is it to drain all that leaked fluid, this kind of gives you a sense. It's very important. So let us continue now. I'm gonna stop this share.
If you kill the worms or if the worms die, then will it like go back to normal?
I probably over time, but at least, I don't know. I don't know. You'd have to talk to somebody who's like a tropical disease specialist. And my assumption is over time, vessels would start repairing. I know like when we're going to talk in just a moment why you rip out your lymph nodes like in cancer. And if you take out a bunch of lymph nodes, you're going to have a lot of edema in the region. And I know eventually it gets better. So, you do have, just like blood vessels can regenerate, I think the lymph vessels can also, but I don't know. I don't know the real trajectory of the disease. So let's go stop the sharing here. And I'm going to now go back to my whiteboard. So another thing I should mention before we move into the lymphocytes. Again, we had the capillaries and the lymphatics coming in, collecting all the leaked fluid. And I mentioned that lymph vessels actually have the ability to kind of have their little endothelial cells flap open in a way that a normal capillary cannot do. So these endothelial cells can flap open and bring in larger things. Oh my God. But, and in general, so they can bring up things as big as cells. And one of the things that they can bring in that are cells are like cancer cells. So let's say you have cancer, cells that are dividing uncontrollably. And let's say the cancer metastasizes. That's when you have little pieces of the cancer, the tumor break free, and you get little little cells that start seeding new tumors. And if you get one of those little tumor stem cells, basically, it can get pulled into one of these little lymph capillaries and basically we'll start moving along. And remember, we talked about the little lymph capillaries all kind of end up in the lymph nodes. But the tumor cells basically start making new tumors in the lymph node. They kind of lodge in the lymph nodes. And then so it's really common when someone has cancer that metastasizes that you start getting all sorts of secondary tumors lodged in the lymph nodes because the little cancer cells that break off get swept into the vessels and then set up camp and start dividing. So if you've probably known someone where they have someone has breast cancer, they usually don't just take out the tumor. They'll also remove all of the axillary lymph nodes as well, because that is likely where, if the little cells have broken off and started second little tumors, where they'll be. So this quality of lymphatic vessels to be able to take up big things can become problematic when you have cancer, because then the cancer cells can get in there and get lodged in the lymph nodes. Okay, so let's now shift gears and we'll talk about the other face of the lymphatic system, which are the immune qualities. And again, we introduced the lymphocytes. So let me make that dark. Lymphocytes, again, which are the specific immune ones, the ones that recognize a particular pathogen. Macrophages are the other major players. Macrophages, big eaters. Again, these are on patrol all over your body. We met them the first week of class, and patrolling around just in your connective tissue. These are the ones, when they eat something that they find, can actually present it to the lymphocytes and say, look what I caught, and tell the lymphocytes to create clone armies to protect you from it. Again, for this class, we're not going into detail. Just know that lymphocytes and macrophages are this really sophisticated system of defense, and in physiology and microbiology, you learn way more about those. So I'm going to define lymphatic tissue now. And sometimes it's called lymphoid tissue. Lymphatic, lymphoid, just synonymous. It's basically tissue that has lymphocytes and usually macrophages, and there is some kind of a framework that they can sit in, and that framework is reticular tissue. If you all remember reticular tissue, it was a type of loose connective tissue with mainly reticular fibers, making these kind of branching. And then you have basically like the lymphocytes just kind of sitting. So the reticular tissue basically makes the framework. Sometimes the framework is called a stroma. In fact, when we had our slides of reticular tissue back in the beginning of class, it was actually slides of lymph nodes that were stained for the reticular fibers. So again, one of the things I usually like at this point in the semester is, let's go back to those slides and realize, oh my God, I can see much more. I'm in a lymph node, but we're not going to do that. So reticular tissue with lymphocytes, macrophages, lymphatic tissue. And it's going to be found all over the place in different situations. So this is the core of it. And now we're going to look at how it shows up in the body. One more thing, actually, before we leave it. So again, lymphoid tissue often has these kind of circular things, circular structures. These are called lymphoid, they can be called lymphoid nodules, or they can also be called lymphoid follicles. These are actually made up of lots and lots of little lymphocytes. So these are mainly B lymphocytes. They're very distinctive looking. These kind of, so this is going to be helpful for you to like recognize that you're actually looking at lymphoid tissue, because you tend to see these kind of round structures. Typically there's kind of a lighter middle called the germinal center. I'm going to show you a bunch. This morning I went on to Google Images and I got a bunch of images which are on the module right now. We'll go over together. So you'll see lymphoid tissue in lots of different situations. So lymphoid tissue is what we're going to talk about now. And we're going to look at it in lymph nodes. We're going to look at it just scattered in the walls of organs. We're going to look at it in your spleen. So maybe this is as good a time as any to show you the first picture here. Kind of what a lymph follicle looks like. Let me share my. Right, looks kind of like this. So all the little dots are just all of these lymphocytes. You know, and as if we go start looking at larger structures, like this is actually looking at a lymph node, you can just see it's got, you know, all these little circles in it. These circles are these lymph nodules or lymph follicles. Again, here, a lymph node is just this thing. We're going to talk about the other aspects, but what I want you to see as we're going through all these lymphatic organs, lymph node, it's got lots of these nodules, these kind of roundish things. There are the lymph nodules all along the, we call the cortex on the outer part of this. Again, these lymph nodules, again, mainly B cells. Again, more of them here. Here's, you know, again, here's actually in your intestine, but again, the same telltale structure, these lymphatic follicles or nodules, whatever you want to call them. So we're going to come back to look at all of these specifically in more detail, but for right now, I'm just trying to give you a overview of like, oh yeah, we're looking all over the place in the body and we keep seeing these similar looking structures. Oh, and this is showing zooming way the heck in. So here's this lymph nodule and we zoom way in now. So each of the individual lymphocytes sitting in this framework of reticular fibers. This has been stained for the reticular fibers. So each of the tiny little dots that make up this thing is actually a little lymphocyte cell sitting in a framework of reticular tissue. Again, I have a bunch of pictures of this. This probably looks familiar to you. You took a picture, you saw this under the microscope. Our slides look a lot like this for reticular tissue. The little reticular fibers, you were actually looking at a lymph node. You were looking at the reticular fibers that are holding the lymphocytes in place in a lymph node when you were looking at the reticular tissue in the first or second week of class. So again, this probably looks pretty familiar. It's probably ringing some bells at this point. Hopefully, maybe. What else? So we'll go. Oh, let's see. So let's go back here. So let's start by talking about a lymph node. So a lymph node, this is a little organ, right? A lymph nodule is just a little collection of lymphocytes. A lymph nodule is not an actual organ. It's just this little round looking structure. But a lymph node is an actual little organ. So be careful, node is an organ. Nodule, which is also called a follicle, is just a little like collection of cells. Lymphocytes. So versus, we're going to see lymphatic nodules in a lymph node. So a lymph node basically is going to have a connective tissue capsule. It's going to have lymphatic vessels coming in. I wish this let me. So, and again, it's actually, I'm drawing it big, filling the screen, but it's about the size of a little bean. It's about the size of a little bean. So we have lymphatic vessels, which are bringing lymph in. Typically, there are more afferent vessels than there are efferent vessels, right? Afferent arriving, efferent leaving. Right? It's the same thing. Afferent arrives at the lymph nodule, efferent vessels exit the lymph nodule. So the lymph kind of builds up and kind of hangs out, percolates in there. It has time for the cells in there to do their cleaning duty before it drains off and continues on its way. This is called the capsule, and it's just dense CT. The capsule kind of invaginates to make these kind of different compartments that are called trabeculae. Well, the little invaginations are called trabeculae. So they're just little places where the dense connective tissue kind of plunges in. And then in the cortex area, cortex again is the more outer part. You've got a whole bunch of these little lymph follicles or lymph nodules. I'll write nodules just to make it clear that it's confusing. So lymphoid nodules are the little collections of lymphocytes that are in the cortex of the lymph node. So, and again, lymph nodules are also called follicles. And then in the medulla is the middle part. There are more connective tissue cords coming through there and more white blood cells. There's macrophages and other kinds of white blood cells. Don't worry about the detail beyond this. This is kind of the detail that you should know a lymph node. You should know it's this little bean-sized and shaped little thing with a capsule of dense connective tissue filled with lymphoid nodules, as well as other like macrophages and things that are basically filtering and doing immune function as the fluid percolates through. That's the main picture of the lymph node you need to know.
What exactly is the cortex?
cortex just means the outer part. It's where we're finding the lymph nodules, lymphoid nodules.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so cortex in general, it's like that word means bark. It's just like the more outer part. And when we get to the kidney, we'll talk about the cortex and the medulla. When we talked about the brain, even the cortex was the layer on the outside. So it just means the outer part. So lymph nodes are all over the place, but there are a few, so some major concentrations of lymph nodes. The main ones people talk about, axillary, which is, where would that be?
In the arm.
Yeah, under the arm. Cervical. You know, your neck. And then inguinal, groin. So when, again, people have, you know, they're fighting something. You know, if you have, if it's like if you have some kind of a throat thing or something, you're going to have the lymphocytes that are living inside these like cervical lymph nodes starting to go into overdrive, and making what we call plasma cells, making antibodies, helping fight whatever's going on. And those cervical lymph nodes are going to enlarge. So for whatever reason, inguinal. For whatever, people call, when people have swollen glands, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about these lymph nodes that are enlarging as the white blood cells are actively dividing and fighting the infection. So again, if we go, let's see. Right. This picture here has, the main collections. What slideshow? Oh, I can't find it. Let's just. How come I can't make it go? There it goes. So pointer, let's do highlighter. Again, cervical lymph nodes kind of here, axillary lymph nodes here under your arm, inguinal lymph nodes in the groin region. Obviously, there are other lymph nodes in other places, but those are the ones people usually think about. And again, in this picture, again, you can see thoracic duct, cisterna chyli. Oh, let me talk a little more about the cisterna chyli. I talked about how the lymph vessels can absorb things as large as cells, which is why you have to, again, if you're gonna get rid of a tumor for somebody who has breast cancer, you're usually gonna take out the axillary lymph nodes as well, because maybe the tumor metastasized there. Another thing that takes advantage of big things being able to go into the lymphatic vessels is, we're going to talk about this in more detail, but absorbing fat from your intestines. So let me, this is just a quick aside. I should have mentioned it already. So lipid absorb. So how are fats different from all the other nutrients and stuff? What happens if you put put a glob of oil in a bunch of water.
It doesn't dissolve.
It doesn't dissolve. So you have fat and you want to absorb it into your bloodstream, but your bloodstream is plasma, it's water. So fats don't dissolve in water. So if you want to absorb fat and get it into your bloodstream, you can't just have the fat as itself. So you have the fat, but then you have a other part, which is this protein part. So this whole thing together is called a lipoprotein because it's a mixture of fat and protein. And this can dissolve in water because the protein part is the part that's actually in the water, in the plasma. But the problem is this thing is big. You can't absorb this thing directly in a capillary to get it into your bloodstream. So in your intestines, you have, in fact, let me just draw. Does anybody remember what kind of epithelium lines your intestines?
Simple squamous.
Nah.
Simple cuboidal?
You
Or
know,
Isn't it pseudostratified?
Say it again.
simple columnar epithelium.
Yeah, it's simple columnar. Okay, don't forget that one. That's an important one. It's going to be coming back. So we have, here is my intestinal lumen. Here's the mucosa of my intestine. You know, inside are going to be, you know, the capillaries, which I can use to absorb my nutrients. You know, in most nutrients, I can just absorb into a capillary, the sugars, the amino acids or whatever. But the fats, I can't. So instead, I'm also going to have lymphatic vessels in here. So here's my lymphatic capillary. It gets the special name of the lacteal. I'll talk about why that's true in a second. But basically, fats are going to have to go into here. You know, because those lipoproteins are too big to get into a capillary. So most nutrients just get absorbed directly into the capillary, but the fats have to get into this lymphatic capillary. And eventually, where is it going to end up?
Bloodstream.
The bloodstream, exactly. So it's going to end up where you want it. It just is going to be a bit of a detour. It's called a lacteal because when the fat gets into the water, it ends up looking kind of milky. In fact, milk is an emulsion of like kind of fat and water. So, you know, lactate means milky. So these little lymphatic capillaries that absorb the fats in your intestine get the special name lacteal. So when we think about functions of the lymphatic system, that's another one. It's important to actually allow you to absorb fats from your diet. And these lacteals, they all drain into the base of the thoracic duct, known as, anybody? Yeah, I think I heard it, the cisterna chyli. So these dudes all drain into the cisterna chyli. You know, this absorbed fats they call chyle, so it actually means the chyle cistern. It's like where all of these are draining into and ultimately going up into your veins to get into your bloodstream. Okay. Continuing. So we talked about lymph follicles in a lymph node, which filter lymph. There's another thing that is kind of similar, but instead of filtering lymph, it filters blood, and that is your spleen. So it's like a really big lymph node, but with blood. So, here's our person. A-OK, oh my God, I just found out you can't actually do like that A-OK thing because instead it's like white power or something. It's like, it's ay. So instead he's giving me a thumbs up because that's still unsullied. So here's his diaphragm. We have to give him front. Kind of squished right here in this upper left part of the abdominal cavity is the spleen. It kind of basically takes the shape of that upper left corner of your body. And we've already met. There's a splenic artery going in. And there's a vein that leaves, although the vein ends up going into the portal system. So it's filled with lymph follicles. And it's basically very much like the lymph nodes, except you have blood percolating around in there, and the white blood cells are helping filter out the blood. This is a major place for recycling worn out red blood cells. And we talked about red blood cells only live like 3 or 4 months max, then they got to get recycled. A lot of that happens in the spleen. Some of it happens and a lot of it happens in the liver too, but the spleen does a lot of that. The spleen can act kind of like a reservoir. You've got a lot of blood just percolating here, but if you've been hemorrhaging and you need to get more blood volume into your system, the spleen can spasm and push more blood into general circulation. That being said, the spleen is one of these organs that you cannot have and you'll be okay. In fact, a couple of semesters ago, I had a woman who did not have a spleen because a car accident and it had just burst apart. And in general, her life was just normal because most of what the spleen does, like, filtering your blood, we're going to see is also something that happens in your liver. So the spleen is not essential in the way, like if you didn't have a liver, you're dead. If you didn't have a heart, you're dead. If you didn't have most organs, you're dead. But spleen, you cannot have. So spleen, in terms of what it looks like, it's a lot like a lymph node, except, blood percolates around, and then there's all of these kind of little lymphoid follicles. And the white blood cells can help cleanse the blood as it percolates through. One of the things that's a little funny, the place where the blood is moving through, they call the red pulp because it's filled with blood. The place where you have the white blood cells, these are white blood cells, so they call this the white pulp. Although under the microscope, since our slides, usually the red pulp is drained, so it looks more white. And the white blood cells are stained purple, so they look actually dark. You are not responsible for recognizing spleen under the microscope. Let me say that out right now to make you feel calmer. You know, it looks a lot like a lymph node, except, you know, it's the same basic structure. These big kind of cavernous capillaries where the blood is percolating around, these are an example of those sinusoidal capillaries. You know, basically they're not, you know, they're not even that much capillaries at all. They're all twisty. They have big gaps in the walls, so the blood's, you know, the immune system cells can go in and process what's going on. So that's the spleen. For whatever reason, in the past, spleen got equated with anger. A lot of times people venting spleen, getting all pissed or something. Or, you know, for whatever reason, spleen has gotten, you know, but the spleen isn't really about anger. It's just about filtering your blood. And there's only one last part to this lymphatic system that we're going to cover, and that is malt. So I will first write it out, and I'll write what it means. Mucosa associated lymphatic tissue. So mucosa, does anybody remember what is a mucosa? By definition, what's a mucosa or mucous membrane? It's a synonym.
It's right outside of body cavities.
So it's lining things that are connected to the external world, continuous with the outside. So if you think about your digestive system, that's all mucosa. If you think about going down to your lungs, that's the thing lining your trachea is a mucosa. The thing lining all of your digestive tract are mucosa. And again, they are continuous with the outside world. So that means little critters have access, and all of a sudden they're down deep in you inside some tube, and they would just love to burrow across the wall and end up in your body. So lining the walls of all of these tubes that are coming down are clusters of lymphoid tissue or lymphatic tissue. So it's basically right on the other side of in fact, if we come back here, I drew this picture here. This was the intestinal lumen. Here's the mucosa. Here's my simple columnar epithelium. And here's all my capillaries and lymphatics for absorbing. If I got more detailed, it's like there's big lymphoid follicles in here too. But I want it black. So basically this idea that you have this collection of lymphatic tissue that's just sitting on the other side of these mucous membranes all over the place in your respiratory tract, in your digestive tract. We're going to look at a few specific examples where it's particularly dramatic. So if we look at just your mouth, hold on, I'm going to draw this better. This is a bad drawing. I can do so much better. Okay, so this is supposed to be your oral cavity here. This is your nasal cavity. This is supposed to be your palate, right? This is your soft palate. What's this little thing, this little doohickey that is hanging there on off the back of your soft palate?
Your tonsil?
Well, no, that little thing is the uvula. But on either side of the uvula are the tonsils. So tonsils, what the heck are tonsils? Tonsils are just malt. They are part of malt. They are little rings. They are lymphoid tissue that ring around the back of your throat. So there are three main tonsils that you are responsible for. There is a tonsil that are called the palatine tonsils that are basically on the back of the soft palate, kind of on either side of the uvula. There's a tonsil at the base of the tongue, which is called the lingual tonsil. And then there's a tonsil on the back of the throat up near the nasopharynx here. This is called the pharyngeal tonsil. The pharyngeal tonsil is also called the adenoids. It's called adenoids because it's actually clusters, collections of lymphatic tissue in that location. So I know that always sounds kind of confusing. Like, why is it called pharyngeal tonsil, but then it's also called adenoids, which sounds plural, but that's the way it is. So you should know these three main tonsils. You should know basically what they are. They're basically just right underneath the mucosa. There is a bunch of lymphatic tissue. And there's actually these little invaginations that actually allow kind of stuff to fall down deep into that area with the lymphatic tissue. They're called crypts. I'll show you a picture of that in a few moments. But basically, that's what tonsils are. They are basically lymphoid tissue, parts of this mucus-associated lymphatic tissue located encircling kind of your throat there. There are other there's little tubal tonsils entering into your eustachian tube even, but these are the main ones. As you continue down in the digestive tract, you still have malt. As we get down into the small intestine, particularly when you get to the ileum. The ileum is kind of the last half of the small intestine. And again, you're going to have a bunch of these lymphoid nodules and lymphatic tissue in the wall. In this particular region, when you have an area where you have a lot of these lymphoid nodules, we call them Peyer's patches. So pick up a nodule, put it in your pocket. Pick up a nodule, put it in your pocket. Pick up a nodule, put it in your pocket. Way down yonder in the Peyer's patches. So that, and I should give you a little more detail. When you look at this lining of the intestine here, again, it's going to be simple columnar epithelium. And you're going to see these big nodules come up underneath it. The intestine is thrown into lots of these villi, these little folds. So when we look at this under the microscope, the simple columnar epithelium is actually running up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down in these villi. We'll talk about villi in more detail later. But the main thing you're going to be looking at today is the lymphoid follicle that's underneath. So are there questions about this? This is kind of the last of what I'm going to talk about on the whiteboard. Now I'm going to go show you a bunch of images. Okay. So let me go and find my folder here. And I can show you this. I was very proud of this. This is my original meme for what did Elsa tell the Pharaoh during the Exodus? Yes, pretty funny. Anyway, let's continue on here. Oh, that's supposed to go away. Let it go. All right. Whoop. Wait, where did it go? All right, so again, here is the lymph follicle, the kind of thing that we recognize as being really, really indicative that you're seeing lymphoid tissue. And then, why is this not? There we go. Something is getting weird here. So here's kind of a classic lymph node. Again, this little bean-like thing. And again, the cortex is going to have these nodules or lymphoid follicles or lymphoid nodules, whatever you call in the cortex. The medulla is more open. Again, this is kind of what you should be able to recognize. If you saw this, you should be, and if it didn't say cortex and medulla, you should like, oh, interesting. I really recognize these characteristic lymphoid follicles here. This is probably a lymph node. And you also know it's a lymph node because it's kind of, you can't really see it this magnification, but it's got kind of connective tissue that is defining the outside because it's its own little independent organ. This is looking at it in more magnification and stained a lot prettier. And here, you know, if I annotate, and let's, you know, connective tissue capsule. It's all around the outside. Again, if you were, again, this is where it's, if you were on your own microscope, you would be able to zoom in and say, oh yeah, it totally looks like dense connective tissue. And then we have these really classic looking follicles. Here, this is a bit of a trabeculae. I talked about how the connective tissue kind of dives in to kind of partition that make different little compartments. This would be kind of like a trabeculae, although, you know, probably go a little deeper. Again, here's just another picture. Here's just another picture. I have these all in the module, so you can have them both as images that are embedded in the page as well as clicks to the files if you want the files.
Can you see where the capillaries are coming in on any of those?
So the capillaries don't come in, right? The capillaries drain into lymphatic vessels. The vessels are the things that come into these. But no, you can't see those on these slides. So this would be like, yeah, this is just kind of a slice through the structure, but you don't see the lymph vessels entering or leaving. But like this image, this is a beautiful image. Like our best lymph node slides look a lot like this. And here again, connective tissue, capsule, lymphoid nodules. This is just classic lymph node. This is now getting into a tonsil. So again, you recognize the lymph follicles. So it's full of this lymphoid tissue, but wait, why is it not? For some reason, it's not getting bigger. If we had the ability to get bigger, you would probably see epithelium on the top. I wish we had a better picture. So this is a tonsil. I'm probably, given that I can't find, didn't find, at school we have some pretty nice tonsils. But it basically, imagine there was stratified squamous on the top here and just lymphoid follicles underneath. And just imagine, oh, this is sitting on the roof of my mouth or something. So this is all a tonsil is. It's just lymphatic follicles sitting under your skin in the back of your throat. That's all a tonsil is. These are Peyer's patches. These are lymphoid follicles. And you can see these are the villi, these little finger-like projections that increase the surface area of the intestine. So whenever you look at the intestine, the lining always has all these little finger-like projections. You know, this is showing at a much lower magnification. Here's the whole tube of the intestine. And, you know, you can just see these are the lymphoid follicles, which again, we would call the Peyer's patches. And, you know, all along, this would be like the simple columnar epithelium lining all these little fingers. But, you know, these are your classic looking Peyer's patches. Was that the last one? Oh no, I got to unzoom. Oh, so this is more Peyer's patches. And hold on, I need to erase this thing here. You know, and again, the basic idea is you should start to get to recognize these really classic looking lymphoid nodules or lymph nodules or lymphatic nodules or lymphoid follicles, whatever you want to call them. Again, this is a reticular tissue that is forming the stroma or the framework for all these little blood cells. Maybe if I zoom in, can I zoom in? Yeah, again, you can see it's like lots of tiny little cells that make up each of these little nodules. And they're all sitting comfortably hanging out in their framework of reticular fibers. So the rest of the slides I have in here are just the reticular fibers. Oh, these are tonsils. Oh, this is a good tonsil. Okay, hold on, I got a good tonsil here. This is showing there's stratified squamous epithelium at the top. This crypt is just a place where stuff can kind of get down so the white blood cells can see it and deal with it. Again, the lymph nodule, the classic looking round thing. So this is a tonsil. This is also a tonsil. Oh, this is a beautiful tonsil. This is actually hilarious. This I found, this is actually sold as an art print because it's beautiful, but it's also really helpful for teaching the lymphatic system. And again, classic looking lymphoid follicles. The mucosa, the skin is up on the top. And I think that's the last one. That is the tonsil. And I think I thought I like, well, there's one other image I'm going to get you. Oh, here. Swollen tonsils. So look, this is the palatine tonsils, the ones that are on the either side of your uvula here on the soft palate. If they get all swollen, you know, obviously it's kind of grody. You know, I got this thing here just to kind of show you pharyngeal tonsil kind of on the roof of the mouth, on the roof of the pharynx there. Let me get a annotator. Hold on, annotate, drawer. Pharyngeal tonsil, can we call the nasopharynx, is kind of in the upper back part of the throat. Palatine tonsil is kind of on either side of the back of the soft palate here. And then lingual tonsil is right at the base of the tongue. Those are the main tonsils. And like I said, there's actually some lymphoid tissue at the entrance to the eustachian tube as well. It's not just these places. You know, when we look at just random slides of the trachea, you can just all this, and now, again, none of the, you're not going to see it, but now that you know what to look for, when you're just like looking at the trachea, you might say like, oh my God, there's a lymphoid follicle underneath the epithelium, because it just shows up randomly as kind of body defenses. It's like, let's put some lymphatic tissue here because we got to protect ourselves from stuff getting into the body. So let me think. Are there questions about all of this? Oh, that's pretty nice. Not quite. I mean that.
I just had a quick question about the spleen. Is it located just right underneath the diaphragm?
Exactly. So it's right, it's like, here's my diaphragm. My liver kind of takes up all this space on the right side, and the spleen is shoved up here on the left side. And the spleen is kind of soft, so it just kind of forms the shape of the corner there. And again, the spleen looks a lot like lymph node tissue under the microscope because it's basically places for liquid to percolate and be processed by lymphatic nodules. It's just the big difference between the spleen and a lymph node is a spleen is cleaning your blood, right? So make sure you remember that. Spleen is about processing and cleaning your blood. The blood percolates through the spleen, whereas lymph nodes are about cleaning that lymph. Lymph, in fact, I should mention the word lymph. Lymph just means that fluid that gets absorbed by the lymphatic capillaries. As soon as the interstitial fluid and associated proteins and whatever else and cells end up in the lymphatic vessels, it is now IW lymph. It's just called lymph at that point. So that's all lymph is. Yeah, other questions? So normally, I do the lymphatic system after the main exam, as a way to kind of just chill a little because it's not as much material. But, given that, we can just, given that we did cover stuff, you can probably just on your own kind of go over this stuff now. Make sure you are able to start thinking about, what is lymphoid tissue? Where do you find it? Understand malt, understand tonsils versus Peyer's patches, and then remember it's just all over the place too. You should also be able to think about the main lymphatic vessels. In fact, if I get this dude, hold on. I am going to, give me 2 seconds here. Share, and I get back into this thing. And now we can add in, let's put the spleen, now that we've talked about the spleen. So there is the spleen kind of sitting right here. And in fact, let me isolate the spleen. And let's add in some blood vessels. Oh, can we? Maybe not. I want to add in the arterial blood vessels that serve the spleen. There we go. So there we have, the splenic artery. If you remember, in fact, this is a good, oh my God, you got to know what this is. What the heck is this? Oh, I just gave it to put its name. What is this thing that's coming right off of the aorta as it pierces the diaphragm that gives rise to the splenic artery?
A celiac trunk.
Exactly, the celiac trunk leading to the splenic artery to the spleen here. Right, so you should definitely, like as you're studying, you might want to remember, oh yeah, splenic trunk. And what is this next major vessel coming off that starts going down to all the intestines?
Gastrin.
Superior mesenteric.
Superior mesenteric artery, exactly. Yeah, so what do we call the main? So here's the abdominal aorta. What is the first main branches that start branching down on either side off of the abdominal aorta?
Common iliac.
Yep, totally, the common iliac. So so remember this exam that's coming up, there's a lot of material. So hopefully you've been keeping up with it. Keep making sure you keep studying for that. It will be a long day. I mean, I don't know what it's normally you get to at least walk around during the lab practical. I'm a little concerned that's, what it's going to feel like to do a like big long exam and take a break and then sit down and just do another hour and a half in front of the computer. I mean, it sounds kind of horrifying to me. But it could be great. I don't know. So we'll see what it's like. And if it's really like too much, then we can adjust like during, for the final, try to do it a little differently. What else? The spleen. Oh, here's the thymus gland. Like I said, kind of this gloopy thing sitting over the heart. In you guys, it's probably not even this dramatic. It gets smaller and smaller as you get older. And otherwise, oh, and then what else? Oh, I know we can do, this is kind of fun. If I turn off the lymphatic, if I took the heart and I cut it, which ventricle would have fatter walls?
The left.
The left. So, ka-ching. Oh, wait, shouldn't that work? Wait, why didn't that work? Oh, I see. I have to get rid of first I'm getting rid of the pericardium. Hold on, how do I do this? Oh, I thought I did this before. For some reason, it's not working now. All right, never mind, as they say. This program, once you get it, it's actually some of the stuff that's absolutely ridiculous, but it's still, for some reason, it's still really fun. Let me clear all this stuff. Like what you can do, like once you have the bones in, you can fracture them. You can like, oh my God, he broke his sternum. Or you can like, oh my God, he broke his humerus. So, it's completely like ridiculous. I'm not quite sure why they even have this, but if you're trying to work out some frustration, once you have it, one thing you can do is just like make fractures and stuff all over the skeleton. All right. So I am going to call it a day, and what are we going to do on the next? We get to endocrine on Thursday. We will continue with the endocrine system. And again, endocrine system also will not be on exam 2. So this is the stuff that is going to be on your final exam, the lymphatic and the endocrine, as well as the rest. But you want to keep up with this, but make sure you're putting focus in. I will have a blood vessel homework as well as probably a blood homework up on the Pearson Mastery before I go to bed. So I definitely recommend taking a look at those as well, both as for studying as well as because I'm still figuring out the, as you noticed, I'm starting to try to consolidate all the grading and start to try to figure out the new rubrics and everything, what it all means. So that's another thing I'm hoping by next week, you will have a more, just like when we started this semester, I told you, oh, your grade is this percent and this percent and that percent. And now it's like, I'm not quite sure what it is. And by the end of this week, I am going to have all of the percentages back in place so you can feel like you know exactly where you are. Because I realize things are a little ill-defined now. So have a good rest of your evening. And if you can like just walk outside of the door, it's like even San Francisco right now, it's freaking warm outside. I walked outside for a second and it was warm. It was like, it's really nice. So I'll see you all on Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
I'll see you Thursday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.